All right. This lecture is going to be over Chapter 2 of your textbook. Chapter 2 deals with Egypt, and so instead of covering everything in this lecture, I really only want to talk about the Egyptian Pantheon, which is about the gods that the Egyptians believed in, and some of the myths that surrounded their belief system. However, I feel as if there is a bit of a deficit in the textbook because there's really no mention of the Rosetta Stone, and I feel as if that's a major contribution to humanities because, for one, it helped to open the door to deciphering hieroglyphs that before that time no one really knew what they said. And so the discovery of this Rosetta Stone opened the door to translate other Egyptian carvings and symbols that they had already in their possession, but they didn't really know what they said or what they meant. But just to give you a little bit of contextualization about the Rosetta Stone. If you've heard of the language learning program Rosetta Stone, the reason it's called Rosetta Stone is because it has a direct metaphor there to connect it to learning languages. And so part of the emphasis of the significance of the Rosetta Stone, the discovery in archaeology, Egyptology, is that it led to understanding other languages. So just to give you a little bit of the history about this Rosetta Stone, it was actually found under the authority of Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1799, it was discovered by a man named Bouchard, B-O-U-C-H-A-R-D. My French is not magnifique. It's not very good. But Bouchard, he was the one who actually discovered it. Now, they came across this Rosetta Stone when they were rebuilding a fort. And they were smart enough to know that this is something we should probably treasure and take care of because it looks important. And so it turns out, though, that the British end up winning the war, and under one of their articles, one of their articles of war, ended up stating that they were going to take possession of artifacts and things like that the French had, of which was the Rosetta Stone. In fact, and ended up landing in London in a museum, and it's there to this day. So if you ever find yourself in London, you can actually go and you can see at the British Museum in London the actual stele that we're going to refer to. But just to give you a little bit about what the Rosetta Stone is, it was found in a town called Rosetta. Okay, right, that was easy. In a town called Rosetta that was actually in what they call the Delta of Egypt, meaning that it was the location in relation to the river, the Nile. So part of the Delta area was this town called Rosetta, and like I said, they were building this actual fort, rebuilding this fort, and they come across this stele. And on it is it's basically just two languages, but written in three different scripts. So the only two languages that are involved on the Rosetta Stone are Egyptian and Greek. The Greek is Demotic and Greek itself. Now, there was a reason for this because, first of all, the hieroglyph was a script used for important religious documents, so it found its inscription on there in hieroglyph because it had a religious significance. And the second was the Demotic, which was the common script of Egypt at the time. The Rosetta Stone was carved in about 196 BC, I think is the dating. And the third script was Greek. And the reason that it was Greek is because under Ptolemy, a Greek emperor, ruler of that area at the time, the Greeks were in charge of Egypt, so things were inscribed in Greek as well. So really, it was two kinds of Egyptian, one kind of Greek. So the French scholars, they knew that this was important, but it ended up falling into the hands of the Brits. But for the first time, it provided scholars with a Greek translation of an Egyptian language. And so that was important. It opened the door to understanding the text, and actually opened the door to understanding other texts that scholars had in their possession. The Greek section was found to contain a decree that was passed on March 27th, 196 BC. By Egyptian priests gathered at Memphis to celebrate the first anniversary of the coronation of Ptolemy V. And that's not Memphis, Tennessee, by the way. Okay, that was a joke. Greeks formed the upper levels of the Ptolemaic bureaucracy, and Egyptian speakers formed the vast majority of the population throughout the Ptolemaic period, 305 to 30 BC, 305 to 30 BC. Or if it makes you more comfortable, BCE. Royal decrees were routinely issued in both Greek and Egyptian. The text of the Greek section of the Rosetta Stone was repeated in the Egyptian hieroglyphic script, used primarily for non-monumental inscriptions. Demotic was, like I said, it's a script derived from hieroglyphs via cursive hieratic. Demotic was the contemporary documentary script embodying the current form of the language in the Ptolemaic period, and was quite different from the hieroglyphs in grammar and vocabulary. The elongated ovals called cartouches. Now this, I think I'm saying that, cartouche. I'm trying to remember. But cartouche were these interesting little round symbols. If you want to actually, I suggest that if you've never seen the Rosetta Stone, to go ahead and Google it. Just look it up on Google and put Rosetta Stone, and you'll see some really awesome high definition pictures of the stone itself. It's black and it's got this inscription on it. It's pretty epic looking, I think. And then also, if you want to see those cartouche, those symbols on the hieroglyphs, you can Google that, and there's some breakdown and explanations in some of the images as well. But what was noticed was that in those hieroglyphs, that royal names in hieroglyphs always had these cartouche symbols. These cartouche symbols, they were round, they were circles, and that was the way that typically you could see something and you could know there would be like an inscription of one of the gods, one of the rulers, and they could see in that would be this circle symbol, and that would be an indication of the royalty. But they weren't really sure exactly what all that meant. When they compared the corresponding royal names to the Greek text, they were able to begin to break down a little bit of the definition. So, in 1819, the Encyclopedia Britannica article that hieroglyphs were basically phonetic, not symbolic, as had previously been thought. It used to be thought that they just represented symbols. They didn't actually make sounds. And that was the breakthrough where they were able to understand what the hieroglyphs actually meant. And that insight alone offered the French scholar Jean-François Champollion the basis for further discoveries. In 1822, his efforts marked the beginning of the scientific reading of hieroglyphs and the first step toward formulation of a system of ancient Egyptian grammar, the basis of modern Egyptology. So if the Rosetta Stone was not found, there would have been no modern scholarly movement of Egyptology. So we wouldn't be able to go and talk about the things we're going to talk about in chapter 2 concerning the Egyptian Pantheon unless we were to likewise understand how modern Egyptology even came about so that we could do it in the first place. So, just to go straight into a discussion on the gods, I just want to mention kind of well, for one, the geographic surroundings and context for Egypt played a heavy part in kind of the development and understanding of their system of gods. So geography, climate, and the realities of their natural environment worked to shape their worldviews, their religious beliefs, not just the Egyptians, but all ancient people. In the hot, arid climate of northeast Africa, where Egypt is, ample sunlight made possible the cultivation of crops. The sun god held the place of honor. So, as you could imagine, life comes about because of the sun, and if you are depending on crops to survive, then the sun, in a sense, is kind of like God. And that's a lot of ancient cultures believed that there was this divinity to the sun, so they worshipped the sun. So the sun god that the Egyptians had was called different names, but among them are Amun, Re, or Ra, or Aten. And this god was considered greater than any other deity in the Egyptian pantheon. Okay, his cult dominated the polytheistic belief system of ancient Egypt for 3 millennia. Now, there was actually a rare strand of monotheism that existed during ancient Egyptian times that doesn't get a lot of attention, but it was under an individual by the name of Akhenaten, who kind of seceded and broke away from the Egyptian pantheon and said, hey, I want to believe in one God. And it would be the earliest recorded ancient example, they think, of an example of a kind of monotheism. However, of course, Judaism, monotheistic. Islam, monotheistic. Christianity, monotheistic, but in a Trinitarian sense. But we won't go into any of that right now. There'll be plenty of time for that later. But so just to kind of give you an interesting glimpse that even in the ancient societies, there was a touch of monotheism. So, but that's a side note. But essentially, Egypt was explicitly a pantheistic society. They had many gods. They believed in lots of gods. So let's see here. Part of the important life in Egypt, depended on the Nile. The Nile was the world's longest river, but it was considered also the gift, like a gift to the area, because of when it would overflow its banks on a regular basis, it would deposit fertile, sediments and soil that would make the along the river very fertile places to plant those crops. So the Nile was considered a very important part of Egyptian thought. The sun was important. The Nile was important. There was a 365-day cycle of the river's inundation, and that became the basis of the solar calendar and the primary source of Egypt's deep sense of order. In the regularity of the sun's daily cycle and the Nile's annual deluge, ancient Egyptians found security. Okay, so from the natural elements, let's grasp this: the sun, the Nile, and the largely flat topography of North Africa helped play a part in how they constructed their cosmology. So cosmology is, if you didn't know, that's the theory of the origin and structure of the universe. And so cosmos, universe, ology, logical thinking. So it's basically the logical thinking of the universe. How did the universe come about? Every major religion, every living religion, and even atheistic, even science, it has a cosmology. It has a determination of how things came to be. To go into the explanation of the Big Bang, for example, this is the form of cosmology, to say how did the cosmos come to be. There was, religions tend to believe in a first cause, a unmoved mover who caused the Big Bang, and then what happened after that. Then there was this, so it goes into a greater explanation of how the planets came to be, the sun, the moon, the stars, etc. But the Egyptians, part of their cosmology was heavily dependent on the river of the Nile, the sun, and the topography. So Egyptian myths, especially their creation myth, they would factor in the actual geography and the natural elements of their area. So, for example, the Egyptian myth of creation says that earth was a flat platter, okay, floating on the waters of the underworld, right? At the beginning of time, the Nile's primordial waters brought forth a mound of silt, out of which emerged the self-generating sun god, and from that god, the rest of Egypt's gods were born. It's not quite in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, but it is nonetheless a cosmology, and that is their creation myth. Ancient Egyptians viewed the sun's daily ascent in the east as symbolic of the god's rebirth and his daily resurrection, signified by the victory of forces of day, light, purity, goodness, and the life over those things of the night, darkness, evil, uncertainty, death. Okay, so in the cyclical regularity of nature, evidenced by the daily rising of the sun, setting of the sun, the Egyptians perceived both the inevitability of death and the promise of birth. Maybe even rebirth, if you wanted to go that route. So, let's see. Now, those who worshipped the sun, we would call them a cult, not necessarily in a derogatory sense, but they were a culture of people sociologically who followed the sun god. So the cult of the sun dominated the religious history of ancient Egypt. Ra was important. So in the earliest hymns of the Old Kingdom, Ra was celebrated as the self-generating life force. Like other ancient deities, he was known by many names, each of which described a different aspect of his power. So his name Amun, or Amun, means he's the giver of the breath of life. His name Atum, the setting sun. Okay, and then Aten, means the disk of the sun. So if you look in your text for reading 2.1, you can actually see a hymn to Aten, or Ra, or Adam, Amun, whatever you want to call them. Hymns of praise were probably accompanied by rituals of honoring the Pharaoh, the divinely appointed representative of the sun. So the Pharaoh was connected to deity, if not considered divine in himself. So the transfer of power from the sun god to the pharaoh was frequently shown in Egyptian tombs and temples. So there's actually a carved relief from the White Chapel at Karnak, the pharaoh Sesostris, wearing the combined crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, and holding the scepter and staff of authority received from Amun, the symbol of life known as the Ankh. If you've ever seen an Ankh, it looks like a cross with a loop at the top. If you see that, that's not a cross. That is called an Ankh. Second, only to the sun as the major natural force in Egyptian life was the Nile River. So we have a god associated with the sun, which was Ra. We have a god associated with the Nile River. So ancient Egyptians identified the Nile with Osiris, ruler of the underworld and god of the dead. According to the Egyptian myth, Osiris was slain by his evil brother, Set, who chopped his body into pieces and threw him into the Nile. But that's not the end. Osiris' loyal wife, Isis, she comes along. We call her also the Queen of Heaven, gathered the fragments and restored Osiris to life. The union of Isis and the resurrected Osiris produced a son named Horus. Horus ultimately avenged his father by overthrowing Set and becoming ruler of Egypt. The Osiris myth vividly describes the idea of resurrection that was central to the ancient Egyptian belief system. Though the cult of the sun and his various aspects dominated the official religion of Egypt, local gods and goddesses, more than 2,000 of them, that's quite a bit of gods, made up the Egyptian Pantheon. These deities, most of whom held multiple powers, played protective roles in the daily lives of the ancient Egyptians. However, the following invocation to Isis, found inscribed on a sculpture of the goddess suggests her central role among the female deities of Egypt. And that's there in your book if you want to read that inscription. But I'm going to just go through a list of the principal Egyptian gods, and then I'll draw this to a close. So to go down the list here, we have Amun, who is the sun god, creator of heaven and earth, sometimes depicted as a falcon or sun rays. And there's Anubis, which was a patron of embalmers, god of cemeteries, sometimes displayed as a jackal. Aten, god of the solar disk. His symbol, usually a solar disk. All right, makes sense. Bes was the helper of women in childbirth, protector against snakes. He, or I guess, I don't know actually, he or she, was lion-faced and a dwarf. A lion-faced dwarf. So Hapi was the god of the Nile, sometimes shown as the bull. And again, just so you know, there are just tons of overlap between the names of the gods and their roles and their connection to the Nile and the sun. And a very, very highly skilled and highly trained Egyptologist might be able to give you lots of distinctions between them, but it's a rather dense concept to wrap your brain around. I think for one, it's ancient, it's very ancient. And for two, I think part of the lack of really understanding the hieroglyph language and having a major disconnection between the ancient culture and the present day culture. There was quite a rift, both intellectually and historically. So, so some of these names of gods, I think they overlap. In fact, you can look in one place and you can find an explanation of the names of the gods and the way they looked, and then you can find in other places, both valid places, different explanations for the names of the gods and the way they look. But according to your book, the one that we're going to stick to are as follows. Picking up there after Hapi, the god of the Nile, who looks like a bull, we've got Hathor, mother, wife, and daughter of Ra, the sky goddess, also looks like a cow. Horus, son of Osiris, and Osiris is the sky god. He is a falcon. Isis, the wife of Osiris, mother of Horus, the fertility goddess, she looks like a female. Maat, goddess of truth and universal order, has a head feather, a head or a feather or a head feather, I'm not really sure exactly. And then you've got Osiris, god of the underworld, typically depicted as a mummified king. Then you've got Ptah, creator of humans, patron of craftspeople. He's a mummified man in his depiction. Then you've got Set, brother of Osiris, god of storms and violence. Looks like a pig, an ass, donkey, hippopotamus. Okay, and then lastly we'll end with Thoth, the inventor of writing, patron of scribes, usually depicted as Ibis, which is a bird, I think, actually. So there you go. So that's what we're going to talk about in chapter 2, the Egyptian gods, and a little bit on the Rosetta Stone. So there you go.